How dare you? Have you heard that? How dare you? It's the question that is usually asked by someone who is outraged about whatever the latest taboo topic is that's not acceptable for enlightened conversation. I had a friend this week who was in a computer chat room. We don't call them that anymore, but in a communication with a number of people, and she made a mistake. She got a date wrong or did something wrong, and they corrected her, and she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, it was just a blonde moment." And the vitriol and the hatred that broke out because of her hateful, bigoted, insensitive comment. "Oh, I'm sorry, that was just a blonde moment." In fact, it was ramped up so much that the moderator of the chat kicked her out of the conversation. What is this world that we live in? Why is everybody so angry? And what is this problem that we're outraged over the most minute, insignificant, random stuff? The progressive left will one of these days finally cannibalize itself because secularism has a theology. It is a theology that involves perpetual outrage. And the reason for the perpetual outrage is because the only way out of your sin in secularism is through what I would call eternal penance. You see, when you have misgendered somebody or you have said something that's not politically correct, you've made a disparaging comment, heaven forbid, against something as simple as saying, "Oh, I had a blonde moment." What happens is there's no forgiveness, there's no mercy, there's only destruction or cancellation. You must be perpetually repentant with no hope of atonement or restoration. That's what cancel culture is. We will cancel you because you have now proven yourself to not be as enlightened as the rest of us. The problem is the target for enlightenment is a moving target. The goalposts keep shifting. And that's why the left will ultimately cannibalize itself, because no one can ever be pure enough all the time. Eventually, you're going to cause offense. I decided to do a little research on this, and I picked the Washington Post. The Washington Post is probably the most powerful newspaper in America besides the New York Times. And I thought, let's see if we can find what outrages have been published in the pages of the Washington Post, the things that the rest of us need to take note of and correct ourselves. Let me just give you some examples. And I'm not going to do a lot of detail here, but let me just show you what I found. The Washington Post, the paper of record in Washington, D.C. I found one article in which a Washington Post food critic wants people to stop using the word exotic to describe foods because he says that to describe food as exotic reinforces xenophobia and racism. He tells me that the word connotes non-European origins and diminishes other cultures. The crucial problem, he says, when you apply it to food, and listen to this. This is why you can't say, "Oh man, I just love exotic food like that." Here's what you're doing, he tells me. When you use the word exotic, particularly when it's applied to food, this is a quote, "you indirectly lengthen the metaphysical distance between one group of humans and another, and in so doing, you reinforce xenophobia and racism." The English language, he says, should adapt more quickly to ostracize words such as exotic, ethnic, or foreign. So there are no descriptions for Mexican food that can be spoken of in polite conversation without you being a white supremacist and a racist. I'm sorry, folks, you're just going to have to label me however you label me, but I love tacos, and that's not going away. He says that to describe food as exotic is to tie that food to the history of colonialism and slavery. Oh my goodness. I mean, do people not have something in their lives that they need to give attention to, that they have time to waste trying to figure out stupid stuff like this? It gets better. Another article in the Washington Post describes the racism inherent in bird watching. So, well, yeah, you didn't know birds were racist. Turns out that the National Audubon Society has been under severe pressure to change their name because Audubon, John James Audubon, the namesake of this Ecological Preservation Society, he owned slaves. He owned 9 of them, as a matter of fact. So now, it's not sufficient that he was an environmentalist who worked to preserve nature. You'd think that he would be a hero of the progressive left with all the climate change and the need to protect nature and mankind is the problem. You'd think Audubon would be a hero, but see, he owned slaves. So he's got to be canceled. He was, as one writer said, an unrepentant enslaver and opponent of the abolitionist movement. In fact, local chapters of the Audubon Society pay attention to these cities, local chapters in Seattle, Portland, Madison, Wisconsin, and Washington, D.C. have all dropped the name Audubon from their organizational labels. Well, it turns out birds are racist too because of the number of birds that have been named after the people who discovered new species, and it turns out that those people don't pass muster as currently 21st century enlightened human beings. For example, Wallace's owlet is named after a naturalist who they say frequently used the N-word in his writings. McCown's longspur is a bird that has been honored until recently by a name that reflects a Confederate general who campaigned against Native Americans. Now listen, I'm not in favor of using the N-word, and I'm not big on Confederate generals who warred against Native Americans. But seriously, these birds, we have to change their names because we have to rewrite history, because we have to believe that only people as pure as us are allowed to have any influence in society. It gets better. There's an op-ed piece that I've given you references for in the resources. A Washington Post, let me say that again, a Washington Post opinion piece that was published in the newspaper charging that it was racist to name George Washington University after George Washington. In fact, they demand that George Washington University rename itself to better reflect the inclusivity, the diversity of the campus. In fact, they have suggested that you might rename the university after Malcolm X or after an abolitionist like Frederick Douglass or Sojourner Truth, because, see, the founding father of our nation is no longer acceptable. What strikes me funny about this particular outrage is that you would think that before the Washington Post ran an editorial about George Washington University renaming itself, the paper itself might want to consider a new name. Well, the left is irony impaired at best. But here's my favorite. Did you know that the pumpkin spice latte that you ordered at Starbucks, you know that popular drink that shows up every fall to great publicity and acclaim, and people stand in line to get their first taste of pumpkin spice for the new year. Bet you didn't know that there's a violent history behind your favorite Starbucks drink, and that by drinking Starbucks pumpkin spice lattes, you are contributing to racism and bigotry. Let me tell you how. Underneath that vibe of fall and pumpkin and the things that people love, turns out there's a dark history, particularly for the spice in pumpkin spice lattes, the spice nutmeg. And we're told in an article in the Washington Post that history is a story of war, genocide, and slavery. Well, I don't have to tell you the whole story. Basically, it comes down to this. In the Middle Ages, there was a tribe of people on an island near Indonesia that began to grow and harvest nutmeg. Turns out in 1511, a Portuguese explorer by the name of Antonio de Abreu became the first European to land on the island, and he conquered the island in the name of the Spanish Empire so that he could secure nutmeg for trade with European nations. The Bhutanese, the tribe that was on the island, resisted that foreign control, and genocide occurred. By 1599, the Dutch had showed up, and things really got gruesome after that. They seized the islands, they built a fort, and they informed the Bhutanese that they were no longer allowed to trade with anybody else. Apparently, thousands of natives died over the course of several generations as Europeans found nutmeg to be a spice that they wanted to control. And now, even after the near extinction of that tribal people, the English show up and begin to battle with the Dutch for control of the nutmeg monopoly. The whole thing was settled by 1667 when the English agreed to relinquish all of its claims to the island and to give up the nutmeg crop. The Dutch actually traded them an island which they considered to be worthless. The island that the Dutch traded to the English so that they could have exclusive rights to the nutmeg trade, the island they traded was a little island that we now today call Manhattan. But here's the bottom line. On the island of Manhattan, which is today New York City, there are no less than 240 Starbucks selling pumpkin spice lattes even as we speak. What's the point? The point is, because we don't live in a culture that understands what it means to offer forgiveness or to extend grace, the only way that you can be acceptable in the secularist culture of our generation is you must be perfect. You must live a flawless life with no marks, black marks against your name for insensitivity or bigotry, or even drinking a drink 500 years after somebody somewhere did something horrible. If you order a pumpkin spice latte from Starbucks, you are guilty of genocide and slavery. You say, well, Pastor, that's ridiculous. Yeah, it is. That's kind of the point. But it's not new. Let me read you a couple of verses. The book of Proverbs is a book of collected wisdom. And in Proverbs, there are a couple of verses that you need to hear. Proverbs 19, verse 11 says this: a person's discretion makes him slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook an offense. In other words, people that are perpetually offended about everything that comes along, we now call them Karens. It's a pejorative term to describe that person that's never going to be happy, because the only way they can maintain their purity is to show how everybody around them is so desperately flawed that only they are the beacons of virtue and purity. In Proverbs chapter 29, also verse 11, it says this, "A fool always loses his temper, but a wise person holds it back." Well, what about the New Testament? Real quickly, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, often called the love chapter, verses 4 and 5 say this, "Love is patient, love is kind, it is not jealous, love does not brag, it is not arrogant, it does not act disgracefully, it does not seek its own benefit, it is not provoked, it does not keep an account of a wrong suffered." Colossians chapter 3, verse 13 says this, "Bearing with one another and forgiving each other, whoever has a complaint against anyone, do so just as the Lord forgave you." You see, the left is going to eat itself. They're going to cannibalize themselves because eventually they're all going to be standing in a little bubble alone, thinking that they're the most pure and righteous person on the planet because everybody else has fallen short of the mark. But you and I, we live in a world where we always knew we fell short of the mark because the Bible tells us that everyone has sinned and we fall short of the glory of God. The standard is perfection, that's true. But secularism hammers the judgment for the imperfect with no hope of grace or mercy. Christianity says, yes, you're imperfect. Yes, you're flawed deeply. Yes, you are not acceptable to God. But God said, while you were still enemies, sinners against me, Jesus came and died so that we could be redeemed. Listen, you want to be popular with the culture? Don't buy into it, because never leave a presentation of grace and mercy to flawed and broken people like you and me in exchange for the trendiness of woke culture, which will let you feel righteous and virtuous right up to the point that you say something wrong. And then you'll be doing penance the rest of your life with no hope of recovery. Let's be followers of Jesus. Let the Jesus who is in us live out his crucified life through us. And the next time somebody gets bent out of shape at you, they get offended, they get upset because of something you've said or done, just smile and say, well, I'm really grateful that in all my imperfection, that there's a Savior who's forgiven me and will make me perfect someday. That's our message. That's our hope. This is Truth Currents.